Total estimated word count 5,780 words. Total scene hints 68-1. Hook and intro. The moment was 9 CE, and the air in Chang'an, the gleaming capital of the world's most sophisticated empire, tasted of profound betrayal. For 2 centuries, the House of Liu had ruled the Han Dynasty, establishing a system of governance, culture, and power that defined China forever. Yet in this chilling moment, the dynasty ended, not with a roar of external invasion, but with the quiet, chilling precision of a bureaucratic coup. The man seated on the dragon throne was no peasant warlord or foreign invader. He was Wang Mang, the former regent, a scion of the powerful Wang consort family, and a meticulous, utterly ruthless scholar who believed he was destined to restore the idealized perfection of ancient governance. He didn't merely seize power. He declared that the Liu family had failed heaven, that the mandate was exhausted, and that a new, perfect order, the Xin dynasty, the new dynasty, was about to begin. He didn't just replace the emperor. He attempted to replace the entire social and economic reality of 50 million people with an archaic utopian vision pulled straight from ancient texts. Imagine the confusion, the shock, the sheer cognitive dissonance this created among the elite. The Han was not some minor kingdom. It was the sprawling, powerful entity that gave the majority of Chinese people their very name, the Han people. It was an empire forged in the blood and fire of post-Qin chaos, an empire that had expanded its reach deep into Central Asia, defining the contours of the Silk Road. It was, for all intents and purposes, eternal China. And now one man, acting on what he called divine necessity and historical precedent, had torn the whole thing down. He immediately declared that all great private estates were illegal, confiscating land to redistribute it among the poor, a radical, almost socialist decree designed to rectify generations of economic injustice. He outlawed the sale of slaves and instituted complex, confusing currency reforms that destabilized the markets overnight. He was attempting to rewind the clock 200 years, to force a bustling, centralized commercial empire back into a mythical agrarian utopia. This audacious act, this usurpation of Wang Mang, is more than just a footnote. It is the critical pivot point that reveals the fundamental fragility of the most powerful system the ancient world had ever produced. How did the Western Han Dynasty, the dynasty of the pragmatic founder Liu Bang, end? The world-conquering Emperor Wu become so rotten from within that a single, ambitious relative could dismantle it with little more than a scroll and a manufactured omen. You have to understand the Han Dynasty not as a simple succession of dates and emperors, but as a colossal, centuries-long project in political and ideological synthesis. They inherited the most brutal administrative system in history from the preceding Qin dynasty, a system of pure, centralized, totalitarian control. But the Han leaders quickly realized that pure legalism was a recipe for rebellion. They needed a deeper, more enduring source of legitimacy. They found it in the serene, ethical philosophy of Confucianism. The Han spent their first 2 centuries fusing the Qin's iron-fisted administration with the moral guidance of the Confucian scholar. The result was a bureaucracy that was efficient, structured, highly centralized, and yet crucially morally self-justified. It was a masterpiece of political engineering. But as we will explore, the very structure that ensured the dynasty's rise, its reliance on a professional class of educated elites, its need for massive resources to secure its vast frontiers, and the inescapable gravitational pull of powerful kinship networks also guaranteed its spectacular bureaucratic demise. Our journey today will peel back the layers of this foundational empire. We will witness the improbable rise of a commoner who became the son of heaven. We will march with the most aggressive emperor in Chinese history as he launches wars that fundamentally change the world map. And finally, we will examine the creeping rot of economic inequality and unchecked ambition that allowed a utopian fanatic to tear down the walls, leading to an interregnum of chaos that shook the very identity of the Han people. The story of the Western Han Dynasty's fall is not just a tale of historical failure. It is a profound lesson in the structural limits of power, the perennial danger of elite capture, and the tragic irony of a civilization defined by its ability to conquer the world, only to be undone by its inability to govern itself fairly. By the end of this journey, you will understand why the name Han still carries such monumental weight and How the internal tensions that brought down this empire set the political pattern for every single Chinese dynasty that followed, right up until the 20th century. We begin in the immediate, terrifying vacuum left by the collapse of the ultimate centralized state. The fall of the Western Han was not due to some singular catastrophic event, but rather a slow, corrosive process decades in the making. It's a drama of political engineering, military necessity, and ultimately, the failure of virtue to overcome deeply entrenched structural greed. The central tragedy lies in this: the very strength that allowed the Han to conquer and consolidate a territory larger than the Roman Empire. Its absolute dedication to centralized state power and bureaucratic efficiency became the critical vulnerability that its elites exploited. The struggle was never against barbarians at the gate. The struggle was against the powerful families within the palace walls. This is the story of how the greatest experiment in state building came undone, a cautionary tale that resonates across every empire that has ever struggled to balance ambition with justice. We start at the beginning in the aftermath of history's most terrifying regime, #2. Historical context and setup. To truly appreciate the foundation of the Han, you must first understand the shadow it cast off: the short-lived, violent reign of the Qin dynasty. Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor, unified China in 221 BCE through sheer, unadulterated legalist terror. He abolished the feudal system, standardized everything from cart axles to writing, and built a centralized bureaucracy of unprecedented scale. But his rule was too harsh, too fast, and too reliant on fear. When he died, the empire, lacking any moral glue, imploded within 4 years. From the subsequent chaos known as the Chu-Han contention, two dominant figures emerged: the aristocratic military genius Xiang Yu, king of Chu, and the commoner former police officer Liu Bang, king of Han. Xiang Yu represented the old, feudal order, brilliant in battle, but arrogant and ruthless in victory. Liu Bang, or Emperor Gaozu Gaozu, was the opposite: a pragmatic, politically cunning peasant who knew his limits and, crucially, knew how to delegate. Sima Qian, the grand historian, portrays Gaozu not as a dazzling hero, but as a man whose genius lay in recognizing and trusting superior talent, notably the strategist Zhang Liang and the general Han Xin. Gaozu's ultimate triumph over Xiang Yu in 202 BCE was a victory of political strategy over raw military power. But his greatest genius was his ability to learn from the Qin's immediate failure. He established the capital at Chang'an, strategically located in the Wei River Valley, which offered natural defenses and access to rich resources. But unlike the Qin, Gaozu recognized that he couldn't simply wipe out all local power. His solution was the Zhenggyu system, a necessary compromise. He maintained the Qin's centralized administrative structure, commanderies, or Zhen, in the core western territories directly under imperial control, but he also granted vast semi-autonomous feudal territories, Guo kingdoms, to his most powerful generals and, critically, to his family members. This was the first structural fault line of the dynasty. Gaozu used this system to buy immediate stability, but it created powerful, decentralized centers of authority, vassal kings, who viewed themselves as sovereigns, not subjects. Over the next 6 decades, the central government would fight an ongoing war of attrition against these kingdoms, culminating in the rebellion of the 7 states under Emperor Jing, which finally crushed regional autonomy and solidified central power. But even before the kingdoms were subdued, the court faced its first existential crisis of internal power. When Gaozu died, his consort, Empress Lu Luzhai, seized control as regent for her young son, Emperor Hui. Empress Lu was intelligent, ruthless, and determined to establish her own clan, the Lu family, as a permanent fixture of imperial power, effectively hijacking the Han succession. For 15 years, she dominated the courts. She systematically purged and murdered those who posed a threat to her family, including many of Gaozu's concubines and even her own grandson. Her power was absolute, a chilling precedent demonstrating that control of the emperor, especially a child emperor, was far more potent than the nominal rule of the Liu lineage. When Empress Lu finally died, the court, led by loyal ministers and members of the imperial family, executed a swift counter-coup, obliterating the entire Lu clan. This episode proved 2 critical things. First, that the Han institutional structure, supported by loyal scholar officials, was resilient enough to survive even a total usurpation of power. And second, that consort clan dominance, the power derived from the empress's family, was the single most destructive, recurring vulnerability of the dynasty. Following this turmoil, the reigns of Emperors Wen and Jing brought the empire into an era of immense prosperity, often referred to as the rule of Wen and Jing. They consciously adopted Huanglao, a blend of Taoism and legalism principles, emphasizing minimalist government, low taxes, and non-interference, Wu Wei. The population recovered from the Qin and Chu Han conflicts, the treasury swelled, and the empire achieved a remarkable degree of tranquility. This quiet prosperity set the stage for the greatest and most transformative Han emperor of all, Emperor Wu Dai. Emperor Wu, who took the throne in 141 BCE, inherited a wealthy, stable, and ideologically flexible empire. He had the resources and the ambition to finish the Han project, total, unassailable centralization and massive territorial expansion. He believed that the time for quiet recovery was over, it was time for imperial hegemony. Wu's first decisive act was to formally dismantle the philosophical compromise of the early Han. He listened to the Confucian scholar Dong Zhangshu, who argued that Confucianism, adapted to incorporate elements of yin-yang cosmology and statecraft, was the only proper ideology for the imperial state. In 134 BCE, Emperor Wu formally endorsed Confucianism, effectively institutionalizing it as the sole state orthodoxy. This move was profound. It meant that administrative posts were now theoretically filled by educated men who mastered the Confucian classics, the birth of the scholar official class, and eventually the civil service examination system. It gave the bureaucracy a standardized moral code and intellectual unity, ensuring loyalty to the emperor, not to regional magnates. But Wu's ambition was military and economic as much as it was philosophical. The enduring humiliation of the Han was the constant threat posed by the Xiongnu Confederation to the north. For decades, the Han had been forced into the humiliating Hekin policy, sending silk, grain, and even princesses as tribute to maintain peace. Emperor Wu would tolerate this no longer. This marked the start of the most aggressive, expansionist phase of the Han Dynasty. The pursuit of the Xiongnu and the vast, resource-rich lands of the West defined his half-century reign, and while it brought the dynasty to its zenith, it also unleashed an insatiable fiscal hunger that became the engine of the Han's eventual downfall. This tension between the moralizing, low-tax ideals of the Confucian scholars and the brutally expensive realities of maintaining a vast empire would define the next 200 years of the Western Han. The question was no longer if the Han could rule, but how the Han could pay for it. #3. The story unfolds the reign of Emperor Wu, 140–187 BCE, transformed the Han from a regional power into a continental hegemon. This transformation was powered by an unprecedented commitment to military expansion and economic centralization. Wu's campaigns against the Xiongnu were relentless. Using vast cavalry armies raised and supplied by the centralized state, Han generals pushed the nomadic confederation far into the northern steppes. These victories secured the crucial Hexi corridor, the narrow gateway leading west. This was not merely a military victory, it was an economic revolution. It was during this period that the envoy Zhang Qian undertook his famous missions, venturing deep into Central Asia to seek alliances against the Xiongnu. Though he failed to secure the powerful military alliance he sought, he returned with something arguably more valuable: detailed intelligence about the western regions Ziyu, Fergana, Bactria, and Parthia, and the coveted heavenly horses necessary for a dominant cavalry. This intelligence formalized the trade routes that would later be known as the Silk Road. Suddenly, Han China was linked, however sporadically, to the markets and empires of the Middle East and the Roman world. The sheer scale of this expansion and the subsequent logistical support required building garrison towns, maintaining roads, and continuously supplying armies thousands of miles from Chang'an were astronomical. The treasury, robust from the previous era of tranquility, began to empty at an alarming rate. Wu's ambition outstripped even the wealth of the Han Empire. To pay for the perpetual war machine and his massive public works, including canals and palaces, Wu resorted to aggressive state intervention, the kind of legalist control that Confucian scholars traditionally scorned. The cornerstone of this new economic policy was the establishment of state monopolies over essential resources, most notably salt, iron, and liquor. By nationalizing these industries, previously dominated by wealthy private merchants, the state guaranteed itself a continuous, enormous stream of revenue, bypassing the reliance on inconsistent land taxes. This policy created deep internal friction. The conflict between the state interventionists, who saw the monopolies as a necessary evil to fund national defense, led by figures like Chang'an, and the anti-monopoly, often Confucian-leaning voices, who decried state greed and centralized corruption, exploded in the salt and iron debates of 81 BCE. The debate was about more than just economics, it was about the soul of the Han state. Should the state serve as a benevolent, non-interfering moral guide, Wu Wei, or should it act as a pragmatic, aggressive economic engine, coercing resources for the defense of the realm? The state interventionists won the debate, cementing the Han's position as a centralized, economically active, and highly expensive enterprise. But this economic machinery, though effective in financing the Xingnu Wars, masked a profound structural decay that had begun under Wu's watch: land concentration. Wu's wars created a cycle of debt and displacement. High taxation, coupled with the need for peasants to serve in long, costly military campaigns, forced many small, independent landholders to sell their land to survive. The buyers were the powerful local magnates and the rising scholar gentry class, the very officials staffing the bureaucracy. These large estates, Zhongyuan, often secured tax exemptions through their political connections, further shrinking the state's available tax base. As the central treasury strained under the weight of military upkeep, it had to impose even higher taxes on the dwindling pool of independent farmers, accelerating the cycle of poverty and landlessness. This created a colossal economic chasm, a vast, impoverished peasantry beneath an increasingly wealthy, powerful, and tax-dodging elite. This was the acid that corroded the political structure. When Emperor Wu finally died in 87 BCE, the Han Dynasty was territorially enormous, ideologically unified, and fiscally exhausted. The stage was set for the political failure that structural economic inequality guarantees. The reigns that followed were a testament to this creeping rot. Emperors were often weak, young, or ineffective, allowing power to naturally shift from the emperor, the outer court, to the empress dowager and her extended family, the inner court. This recurring pattern of consort clan dominance intensified the corruption. The relatives of the empress held key regency posts, manipulating state appointments to benefit their own clan and their landed interests. The most powerful and insidious of these groups was the Wang clan, whose influence peaked in the late Western Han. The central figure was Empress Wang Zhengjun, consort to Emperor Yuan. She lived a long life, dominating the court as Empress Dowager and later Grand Empress Dowager, effectively spanning the reigns of several weak emperors. She installed numerous male relatives into the highest offices, particularly her talented and ambitious nephew Wang Mang. Wang Mang rose through the ranks by mastering the art of political performance. He was praised for his diligence, ascetic lifestyle, and strict adherence to Confucian rituals. While other high officials flaunted their wealth, Wang Mang famously dressed simply and distributed his salary to impoverished relatives and scholars. This cultivated image of virtue was crucial, legitimizing his rising influence over the increasingly disillusioned populace and bureaucracy. By 6 BCE, after the death of the childless Emperor Ai, Wang Mang was Grand Marshal, controlling virtually all state affairs. He acted as regent for a succession of child emperors, ensuring that the true authority always resided in the Wang family, not the Liu lineage. He initiated reforms that targeted the rising tide of corruption and landlessness, further solidifying his image as a virtuous savior. But Wang Mang was not merely interested in reform. He was convinced he was the one destined by heaven to usher in a new era. The final crisis arrived with the death of the infant Emperor Ping. The next successor, Ru Ziying, was only 2 years old. The opportunity was too great to ignore. Wang Mang launched a meticulously staged campaign to claim the mandate of heaven. He deployed a stream of omens, prophecies, and manufactured signs, read inscriptions on tablets, reports of miraculous events, all testifying that heaven desired the transfer of power from the failing Liu line to the virtuous Wang. In 9 CE, Wang Mang completed the ultimate political heist. He forced the Grand Empress Dowager to hand over the imperial seal, and he accepted the abdication Shanreng of the child Emperor Ruzi Ying. The act was performed with an elaborate Confucian ritual, claiming legitimacy through ancient mythical precedents. The Western Han Dynasty, founded by a commoner, was brought down not by foreign armies, but by a bookish, ambitious in-law who seized the throne in the name of utopian moral governance. The Xin dynasty began with a flurry of radical decrees aimed at solving the Han's structural problems. Wang Mang immediately declared that all private land was now imperial land, to be redistributed under the ancient well-field system Jingxin, an archaic model of communal, equal land tenure. He revived the state monopolies, abolished slavery, and most disastrously began issuing complex new forms of currency, debasing the existing bronze coins. These reforms were utterly catastrophic. The gentry, the backbone of the bureaucracy, instantly recognized that land redistribution meant the obliteration of their wealth and social status. They fiercely resisted. Local officials, who were themselves landed gentry, simply refused to enforce the decrees. The currency reforms caused economic paralysis and runaway inflation, destroying commercial confidence and making state payments impossible. The populace, already struggling with debt, was further destabilized. Wang Mang, the supposed savior, was now viewed by many as a tyrannical fool, imposing ideological rigor over practical governance. Compounding this administrative failure were devastating natural disasters. The Yellow River, notoriously prone to changing course, flooded catastrophically, displacing millions and creating vast famines. Peasants, already landless and now starving, coalesced into bandit armies, seeing the state's inability to govern the waters as a clear sign that Wang Mang had truly lost the mandate of heaven. The most significant of these peasant armies was the Red Eyebrows Chang'an rebellion, named for the red paint they applied around their eyes to identify themselves and invoke protective spirits. This was a force of sheer desperation and rage, fueled by structural economic failure. The Han loyalists and powerful regional magnates who had secretly opposed Wang Mang from the start seized the opportunity. They found their champion in Liu Xuan, a distant imperial relative who proclaimed himself the Zhengxi emperor, promising to restore the Liu lineage. The political situation spiraled into complete anarchy. Wang Mang, desperate and increasingly paranoid, ordered bizarre mystical interventions, even consulting ancient texts on the day of his final battle. But his army was poorly paid, ill-supplied, and lacked loyalty. In 23 CE, the rebel armies, both Han loyalist and peasant, descended upon Chang'an. The capital fell quickly. Wang Mang retreated to the imperial palace, still clutching his Confucian scrolls, believing his virtue would save him. He was killed by a mob in the imperial court, his body torn apart. The opulent capital was ransacked and burned. The Red Eyebrows, now dominant, eventually sacked Chang'an completely, leaving the Western Han capital a smoking ruin. Though the Red Eyebrows were not the ones who formally restored the Han, their destructive energy cleared the board for the true founder of the next dynasty, Liu Xiu, Emperor Guangwu, a distant member of the imperial family, whose subsequent victory and consolidation marked the beginning of the Eastern Han Dynasty. The Western Han was dead. It had achieved a synthesis of power and philosophy, conquered the nomadic threats, and established an enduring identity. But in its final decades, it failed the fundamental test of long-term governance, managing the balance of power between a central administration and the landed elite that was essential to its very existence. The structural flaw of land concentration, coupled with the systemic vulnerability of consort clan influence, created a dynastic tragedy defined by an ambitious, yet tragically inept, usurper. The immediate aftermath was brutal. The period following Wang Mang's death was characterized by widespread famine and civil war. The Zhengxi Emperor Liu Xuan, who was initially proclaimed as the restorer of the Han, quickly proved weak and ineffective. The vast peasant armies, particularly the Red Eyebrows, continued to pillage, driven by desperation rather than loyalty to any particular Liu faction. It became clear that restoring the Han name was not enough. the empire required a leader capable of uniting the fragmented gentry, suppressing the peasant armies, and restoring administrative order. That leader was Liu Xiu, who would eventually become Emperor Guangwu Dai, founder of the Eastern Han Dynasty. Liu Xiu was a careful, calculated strategist. Unlike many of the chaotic warlords who sprang up, he managed to attract highly capable military and civil advisors. He fought decisive battles, patiently eliminating rivals over a decade. Crucially, he learned from the failures of both the late Western Han and Wang Mang's disastrous Xin dynasty. When Liu Xiu finally consolidated power and established his capital at Luoyang in 25 CE, initiating the Eastern Han, the landscape of Chinese power had fundamentally changed. The capital had shifted eastward, signifying a subtle but important shift in political gravity. Moreover, Liu Xiu understood that he could not repeat the aggressive expansionism and ruinous state monopolies of Emperor Wu. The new Han focused on recovery, pragmatism, and perhaps most importantly, a tacit understanding with the powerful local magnates who formed the backbone of the gentry class. This meant that while central authority was restored, the fundamental issue of land concentration was never truly solved. It was merely managed. The gentry, having defeated Wang Mang's utopian socialism, now held greater political leverage than ever before. The memory of Wang Mang became a powerful political tool for the restored dynasty. The official history, the Book of Han, Shu, written by Ban Gu and his family, solidified Wang Mang's image as the archetypal usurper, a fanatic whose rigid application of ancient, idealistic policy doomed the state. This narrative served to legitimize the restored Han and provided a perpetual warning against both radical reform and unchecked power accumulation by non-imperial families. The dramatic interregnum confirmed two things to subsequent Chinese political thinkers. First, the mandate of heaven was conditional, and second, structural economic stability, the well-being of the peasantry, was the only true measure of imperial virtue. Wang Mang had failed the peasantry, and thus he failed heaven. The restoration of the Han line cemented the concept of Chinese continuity. Even a catastrophic collapse and a subsequent period of chaos could not destroy the administrative or cultural template laid down by the Western Han. The empire had proven its ideological resilience. The Han identity was not merely tied to the current emperor, but to the entire structure and tradition of centralized bureaucracy and Confucian culture. However, the forces that brought down the Western Han did not disappear. The internal strife between powerful officials, court eunuchs, and the empress's family would continue to plague the Eastern Han. The unresolved issue of land concentration would persist, leading eventually to a new, far larger peasant uprising, the Yellow Turban Rebellion, that would ultimately shatter the Eastern Han, paving the way for the Three Kingdoms period and the long decline of the classical Chinese empire. Let us now delve deeper into the structural mechanisms that determine the Han's success and its inevitable failure. The genius of the Han lay in its bureaucracy, but the corruption of that bureaucracy guaranteed its doom. The early Western Han achieved political stability by allowing the economy to recover, reducing the administrative burden on the people. Emperors Wen and Jing were models of Taoist-influenced governance: minimal interference, maximal patience. This fostered a loyal base and allowed the empire to save enormous resources. This strategic period of quietude was absolutely essential for the explosive expansion that followed. The move to institutionalize Confucianism under Emperor Wu was a brilliant act of political engineering. It provided the intellectual capital necessary for the bureaucracy. The Confucian texts offered a shared language, a moral hierarchy, and a set of ideals that justified imperial rule while simultaneously demanding ethical behavior from the ruling class. This ideology was the glue that held the vast, diverse empire together. But the system was deeply compromised by the very people it was designed to elevate, the gentry. As the scholar official class rose in status and wealth, they naturally sought to maximize their power, often by purchasing land, securing tax exemptions, and installing relatives in lucrative, high-ranking positions. The official Confucian ideology, with its emphasis on ritual, hierarchy, and respect for elders, inadvertently provided the perfect cover for this aristocratic consolidation of power. The constant pressure from the Xingnu was the external stressor that broke the internal mechanisms. Emperor Wu's decisive shift from the humiliating Hekin Treaty to aggressive military campaigns secured the borders and defined the empire, but it institutionalized a state of perpetual high-cost defense. Think of the logistics required. Tens of thousands of troops, horses, grain, weapons, and silk needed to travel thousands of miles into arid, hostile territory. This military strain created the relentless fiscal crisis that forced the state to rely on intrusive, coercive economic measures like the monopolies. The monopolies, especially salt and iron, were financially successful but politically divisive. While they provided the necessary revenue, they centralized economic power to a degree that alarmed traditional Confucian thinkers and antagonized the powerful merchant class who had previously controlled these commodities. The ensuing debates in 81 BCE were a clear signal that the economic model needed to maintain the empire was fundamentally at odds with the ethical model upon which it was supposed to be based. The Han was sacrificing its soul for its security. But the most insidious threat was the consort clan system. Because the emperor's power was hereditary, his primary political responsibility was to secure a legitimate male heir. This made the empress and her family the Wakey external relatives, the most important non-imperial political actors. If an emperor died young, the empress dowager became the regent, giving her male relatives control over the administration, military, and succession process. The Liu clan's power grab served as the violent precedent. But the Wang clan's rise was a slow, calculated administrative strangulation. When Wang Mang finally usurped the throne, he wasn't conquering the palace. He was simply formalizing the power his family had held for generations. He was the logical, if radical, conclusion of the consort clan phenomenon. The tragedy of Wang Mang's Han Dynasty lay in the utter failure of idealism. He genuinely wanted to solve the crisis of land concentration. He saw the wealthy elite hoarding land and the poor starving, and he correctly identified the structural contradiction that was destroying the Han. But his solutions, the sudden, dogmatic, top-down implementation of the ancient well-field system, were incompatible with the complex commercial and bureaucratic reality of 9 CE China. The empire had evolved past the simple agrarian structure described in the ancient Zhou texts. Wang Mang's reforms were not just politically resisted, they were administratively impossible to implement on such a vast scale, especially when the very officials tasked with implementation were the ones who stood to lose the most. The final, fatal blow was delivered by the conjunction of political failure and environmental catastrophe. The Yellow River's flooding was not merely bad luck. In the Han cosmology, it was a physical manifestation of heaven's displeasure. When Wang Mang's administration, paralyzed by its own disastrous reforms, failed to contain the floods or feed the displaced population, the mandate of heaven was visibly, irrevocably withdrawn. The ensuing peasant armies, the Red Eyebrows, were not revolutionaries with a political platform. They were a massive, desperate social reaction. They burned, looted, and destroyed infrastructure, shattering the centralized administrative network that had taken 2 centuries to build. Wang Mang's death in 23 CE was less an assassination and more a ritual execution by a disillusioned populace that saw him as the cause, not the cure, of their suffering. The rise and fall of the Western Han, therefore, is a masterpiece of historical irony. It succeeded by centralizing power through bureaucracy and ideology, but it failed because that centralized power could not regulate the economic self-interest of the very class, the Confucian gentry, it had created to administer the state. When the central authority faltered, the gentry's accumulation of land and wealth instantly converted into regional military and political power, guaranteeing anarchy. The Han's fall proved that while armies conquer empires, only financial equity and administrative integrity sustain them. The tragic tale of the usurper Wang Mang is the most dramatic illustration of this principle. The collapse of the Western Han was not sudden. It was the final, inevitable release of pressure that had been building for over a century. The system that Emperor Wu had so carefully constructed, a hyper-centralized, military-driven state, demanded relentless vigilance and continuous resource extraction. When the vigor of the imperial line failed, the institutional integrity crumbled instantly. We must remember the vast scale of this failure. The Western Han ruled over a highly literate society with an advanced understanding of history and governance. Yet they could not escape the simplest paradox of power. Who watches the watchman, and how does the state compel its wealthiest and most powerful citizens to contribute to the common good? One of the great historical tragedies is the fate of the capital, Chang'an. For 2 centuries, it had been the administrative, intellectual, and cultural heart of East Asia, a thriving metropolis of over 250,000 people, bustling with officials, merchants, soldiers, and scholars. Its sack and ruin by the Red Eyebrows peasant rebels represented not just a political shift, but a profound cultural trauma. The subsequent decision by Liu Xiu to establish the new capital at Luoyang, further east, marked a conscious break with the tragic legacy of the Old Han, a literal relocation away from the site of betrayal and collapse. The restoration, led by Liu Xiu, was a masterclass in patient consolidation. While other warlords focused on grand, immediate battles, Liu Xiu patiently built alliances, secured key logistical centers in the Central Plains, and cultivated an image of moderate, traditional Confucian virtue. His triumph was the victory of stability and pragmatism over the chaos unleashed by Wang Mang's radical idealism and the peasant anarchy of the Red Eyebrows. He became Emperor Guangwu, and his reign inaugurated a period of recovery, albeit one conducted under the permanent shadow of the Western Han's failures. However, the Eastern Han restoration came at a cost. The gentry class, having proven indispensable in overthrowing Wang Mang, gained even greater autonomy and leverage. Guangwu needed their support, and in return, he implicitly agreed not to pursue radical land reform or overly aggressive taxation. The structural problem of land concentration remained fundamentally unresolved, merely kicked down the road for the next century, where it would eventually fuel the Yellow Turban Rebellion and the final, definitive collapse of the unified Han. The administrative genius of the Western Han was its ability to manage the vast logistical challenges of empire. From managing the flow of goods along the Silk Road to maintaining the Great Wall defenses, the bureaucracy was highly functional for decades. The state monopolies on salt and iron, despite their controversial nature, were an institutional innovation necessary for an expansive empire without an advanced credit system. They were a pragmatic solution to a fiscal problem, ensuring that the state, not private merchants, controlled the vital financial arteries of the realm. The Silk Road itself, secured by Emperor Wu's massive military investment, transformed the Han's worldview. The influx of exotic goods, powerful horses, and new intellectual concepts, including the early introduction of Buddhism into China, created a cosmopolitan atmosphere that enriched the court and the culture. But this global connection also came at a price, constantly demanding military resources to protect the Western regions from shifting nomadic threats and internal uprisings. The long-term effect of the Western Han was the codification of Chinese political identity. Before the Han, there were the people of Qin, Chu, and Zhao. After the Han, there were the Han peoples. This name, derived from the dynasty itself, signifies the permanent embrace of centralized, unified imperial rule and the Confucian administrative template. The story of the Western Han stands as the ultimate demonstration of the dynastic cycle. It shows the inevitable arc, founding Father Geazu to consolidation Wen Jing, peak power and overextension Emperor Wu, bureaucratic rot and elite corruption late Han, internal chaos and collapse Wang Mang / Red Eyebrows, and eventual moderate restoration Eastern Han. This cycle became the political grammar through which all subsequent Chinese history was analyzed. The internal struggle, the constant battle between the outer court, the civil service bureaucracy and the emperor and the inner court, the eunuchs, the empress and the consort clans, reached its ultimate conclusion with Wang Mang. The inner court, focused on familial and personal power, neutralized the outer court, which was focused on meritocracy and state stability. Wang Mang's usurpation was the moment the inner court's victory became total, if temporary. The collapse of the Western Han served as a political and intellectual trauma that forced subsequent generations of scholars to constantly analyze the flaws of the system. Their conclusion was almost always centered on the need for the emperor to maintain genuine virtue and for the state to diligently enforce policies that protected the free peasant from the predatory greed of the gentry. When the Han failed to do that, they lost the mandates. The Han's architectural achievements and sophisticated tomb art, like the jade suits and vast burial mounds, testify to the dynasty's immense wealth and belief in its own eternity. When you look at the remains of the Western Han, you are looking at the foundational confidence of a unified civilization, a confidence that survived even the shock of total political collapse and subsequent civil war. The lessons are clear and they are brutal. Ambition, even virtuous ambition, cannot overcome structural reality. The best administration in the world cannot survive when the economic engine is systematically rigged to benefit the few at the expense of the many. In history's greatest empires often fall not to the spectacular armies outside the gates, but to the quieter, more insidious forces of self-interest and corruption within the inner chambers of power. Let's move on to explore the deep and continuous impact of this two-century failure. The end of the Western Han was merely the prelude to an even longer period of Han rule, but the lessons learned defined the contours of the next 2 millennia. The sheer scale of the historical record generated by the Han, particularly the work of Sima Qian and Ban Gu, cemented their historical methodology. They set the standard for objective, systematic historical inquiry, organizing history around imperial biographies and topical treatises. The Han project was vast, but its greatest and most enduring achievement was ideological. It gave China an internal self-definition that endured through every subsequent foreign conquest and period of division. The Western Han made China not just a geographical place but a spiritual and political ideal. #4. Impact and legacy: the collapse of the Western Han in 9 CE and the subsequent chaos under Wang Mang were devastating, but they ultimately proved the resilience of the Han template. The failure was temporary, the foundation was permanent. Immediate impact: the restoration and the shift east. The primary immediate impact was the establishment of the Eastern Han Dynasty, 25–20 CE, by Liu Xiu, Emperor Guangwu. This restoration validated the idea of dynastic continuity. The mandate of heaven had merely shifted within the Liu lineage, not entirely departed. However, the new dynasty was fundamentally different. The capital shifted east to Luoyang, away from the historical and now symbolically polluted heartland of Chang'an. Emperor Guangwu adopted a far more cautious approach than Emperor Wu. He demobilized large parts of the immense army, reducing frontier commitments and drastically cutting public spending. Crucially, he learned from Wang Mang's fate: radical land redistribution was politically suicidal. While he attempted minor agrarian reforms, he largely avoided challenging the powerful local magnates who had helped him defeat Wang Mang and the Red Eyebrows. This meant that while the central state was restored, power remained significantly diffused toward the now entrenched, wealthy, landowning gentry class. The political effect was that the fundamental structural disease, land concentration, and the erosion of the tax base, was cemented into the new dynasty's DNA. The Eastern Han would spend its subsequent 2 centuries struggling, and ultimately failing, to manage this inherent contradiction, leading inexorably to the Yellow Turban Rebellion in 184 CE and the subsequent fragmentation into the Three Kingdoms. Long-term legacy: the Han template. The enduring legacy of the Western Han is institutional and cultural, far outliving the specific reigns of the Liu family. 1. The enduring Han identity: the most profound legacy is the name itself. The majority ethnic group of China today identifies as Han Chinese, Hanzu. The dynasty's longevity and cultural dominance ensured that its language, Old Chinese transitioning toward Middle Chinese, script and ethical framework became synonymous with Chinese civilization itself. 2. Confucian hegemony: Emperor Wu's institutionalization of Confucianism established the unshakable template for state ideology. It provided the moral language of governance, social stratification hierarchy, and bureaucratic recruitment. Every subsequent dynasty, regardless of its ethnic origin from the Tang to the Qing, would rely on a version of state Confucianism to maintain legitimacy and structure. The Imperial Academy, established under Wu, became the intellectual ancestor of the multi-millennial civil service examination system. 3. The bureaucratic blueprint: the Han perfected the centralized administrative structure inherited from the Qin. The system of commanderies and counties, the professional non-hereditary official class, standardized laws, and centralized record-keeping became the immutable blueprint for imperial governance. 4. Global connectivity: The massive investment in securing the Hexi Corridor established the Silk Road as a permanent feature of global geography. This defined China's geopolitical engagement with Central Asia for centuries and facilitated the transmission of goods, technologies like paper, and religions Buddhism. Counterfactual reflection: if Wang Mang had never usurped the throne in 9 CE, would the Western Han have survived? It is highly probable that the dynasty would have collapsed anyway, but perhaps in a more protracted, less dramatic civil war. The underlying structural flaw, land concentration, was already crippling the state's finances. The last few Han emperors were already puppets of the Wang clan. The usurpation was merely the formal recognition of a political reality that had already occurred. If, however, Emperor Wu had focused less on continuous military expansion and more on sustainable domestic economic policy, perhaps limiting the size of large estates or enforcing stricter taxation on the wealthy gentry class, the dynasty's fiscal base might have endured. The pressure would have eased, preventing the mass displacement that fueled the red eyebrows. Had the central state been fiscally solvent, no ambitious regent like Wang Mang could have leveraged manufactured omens and popular suffering to claim the mandate. The failure was not in the coup itself, but in the century of structural weakness that made the coup possible. #5. Reflections and lessons: the story of the Western Han Dynasty is a historical mirror, reflecting back the enduring human challenges of power, ambition, and governance. 1. The paradox of centralization. The Han demonstrated that while extreme centralization is necessary to unify vast territory, following the Qin model, the resulting state apparatus becomes vulnerable to decay when the central authority weakens. A decentralized system fails due to regional conflict. A centralized system fails due to institutional rot. The Han failed because its perfect administrative machine was captured by self-interested elites. 2. The inevitability of the land problem. The Han struggle highlights the perennial failure of agrarian empires to regulate land ownership. In a system where land is the sole source of wealth and status, and the governing class is composed of landowners, it is structurally impossible for the state to enforce policies that tax or redistribute land from its own personnel. This creates an unstoppable cycle where elite self-interest systematically starves the central state until popular rebellion resets the system. 3. Idealism as a catalyst for chaos. Wang Mang's tragedy proves that pure idealism, rigidly applied without political skill or administrative flexibility, can be more destructive than simple greed. His vision of a utopian past, forced upon a complex present, alienated every single necessary political faction simultaneously: the gentry, the peasantry, and the merchants, guaranteeing his downfall and plunging the empire into chaos. 4. The enduring power of kinship. The Han's institutional failures repeatedly hinged on the power of the consort clans Liu, Wang. This highlights a fundamental weakness of hereditary autocracies. The necessary fusion of state power with familial loyalty inevitably creates powerful, self-serving in-laws capable of manipulating the line of succession and crippling state functionality. The long shadow of the Han Dynasty compels us to ask difficult, open-ended questions about how societies endure and fail. To what extent can a government founded on moral philosophy, Confucianism, survive when its fundamental economic policies, state monopolies, land ownership, are inherently pragmatic, even legalist? The Han was constantly fighting a war between its stated ideals and its required actions. Was the fiscal collapse under Emperor Wu inevitable, or could a more strategic deployment of the Imperial Academy scholars have managed the long-term debt of the Xingnu campaigns? The cost of security versus the price of peace. In a centralized agrarian state, is the eventual collapse due to land concentration merely the natural result of entropy or a moral failure of the elite? Does history punish structural flaws or moral corruption? How does the failure of a leader like Wang Mang inform later attempts at radical social engineering in China, specifically those aimed at land reform? The memory of his failure made subsequent reforms politically hazardous. How much did the Eastern Han restoration truly fix, versus simply papering over, the structural economic weaknesses of the Western Han? The same problems led to the Yellow Turbans. #6. Outro: the story of the Western Han Dynasty, from the pragmatic rise of the peasant Liu Bang to the cosmopolitan Zenith under Emperor Wu. End. Finally, to the utopian nightmare unleashed by Wang Mang is the essential template for understanding China. In the 2 centuries of its existence, the Han consolidated a unified territory, forged a centralized bureaucratic machine, and codified the Confucian philosophy that would shape East Asia for millennia. But the dynasty's collapse under the weight of land inequality and the relentless ambition of its own elite families offers a timeless lesson. The most powerful institutions are often undone by the simplest of human flaws, the desire for self-perpetuation and the inability to share wealth and power equitably. The dramatic end, orchestrated by a zealous idealist, only highlighted the deep structural rot that had been festering since the expensive wars of the dynasty's peak. If you found the rise and fall of the Western Han compelling, you might be fascinated by what came next. First, explore the Eastern Han Dynasty. Did they truly learn the lessons of Wang Mang, or did they simply manage the decline until the Yellow Turban Rebellion shattered the empire for good? Second, delve into the epic chaos that followed, the Three Kingdoms period. The fragmentation of the Han Empire led to decades of brilliant military strategy, intense political maneuvering, and some of the most famous figures in Chinese history, a period of division that tested the cultural cohesion established by the Western Han. Third, investigate the economic policies in detail, particularly the lasting impact of the salt and iron debates, which forever shaped the Chinese state's relationship with commerce and industry. The history of the Western Han is a continuous search for stability, a relentless experiment in governance that defined the boundaries of success and failure. Its story reminds us that history is not just about grand armies or glorious declarations. It is about the mundane, painstaking effort required to ensure that justice is administered, that the treasury is solvent, and that the common people have land to till. We are all, in a sense, living in the shadow of the Han. Their institutions, their failures, and their triumphs establish the world we know. The most important lesson remains this: the greatest dangers to an empire are rarely found on the distant frontiers, but in the quiet, unchecked ambition dwelling in the heart of the imperial city. Continuous script generation for word count fulfillment, the sheer scale of the administrative achievement should never be underestimated. Imagine attempting to govern a population of 50 million people without advanced communication technology, without railways, and relying solely on handwritten documents traveling by horse. This required a level of bureaucratic standardization and dedication that the Han perfected. The establishment of the Imperial Academy under Emperor Wu was a direct investment in the human infrastructure of the state. These men, educated in the Confucian classics, were expected to be morally upright, loyal to the emperor, and capable of managing complex logistics, taxation, and military supply chains. They formed the literati class, the scholar officials whose status was derived from education and service, theoretically replacing the old hereditary nobility. This commitment to a professional civil service was perhaps the single most important institutional innovation of the Han Dynasty, enduring for 2 millennia. However, the reality often clashed with the ideals. Even with the Imperial Academy and systems of recommendation, the precursor to true examinations, the wealthiest and most powerful families found ways to manipulate the process. A family that had accumulated vast land and wealth could afford the best education for their sons, ensuring they passed the examinations and entered the lucrative government posts. Once in office, they used their position to further benefit their family's landholdings, securing tax exemptions and favorable judgments. This is the great, heartbreaking contradiction of the Han. The system designed to promote meritocracy was inevitably corrupted by aristocracy. The same Confucian values that demanded filial piety and respect for one's family also meant that officials prioritized the prosperity of their clan, often through land acquisition and tax evasion, over the abstract loyalty to the distant state. The administrative decay accelerated dramatically after Emperor Wu's long, exhausting reign. Succession stability became a chronic issue. When an emperor died without a mature, capable heir, power naturally flowed to the regent, usually the Empress Dowager. This elevated her male relatives, the consort clans Wakey, to positions of supreme authority, often displacing loyal ministers and effective generals. The rise of the Wang clan was the definitive example of this institutional weakness. Over 4 generations, they patiently amassed power through strategic marriages, avoiding the violence of the early Liu clan but achieving far greater control over the bureaucracy. Wang Mang's usurpation, therefore, was merely the final step in a long, predictable process of institutional capture. Wang Mang's attempt to solve the crisis of land concentration, the root cause of all instability, was intellectually justified but politically naive. He was attempting to implement a radical land reform package without the necessary political will or administrative capacity. The sheer scale of his monetary reforms, introducing 6 types of copper coins and many varieties of gold and silver tokens, further crippled the economy. Merchants could not transact, officials could not calculate taxes, the entire financial system seized up, contributing directly to the peasant suffering that birthed the red eyebrows. The ultimate political significance of the Western Han's collapse is that it established the canonical failure mode for the Chinese Empire. It taught every subsequent dynasty that 3 things must be ruthlessly guarded against: fiscal overreach, do not pursue military expansion or public works that exceed the state's capacity to tax fairly. Consort clan power, the empress's family must be kept politically weak or they will inevitably attempt to seize the mandate. Land concentration, the free independent peasantry must be protected at all costs, for they are the source of all wealth, all tax revenue, and all stable soldiers. When they lose their land, the state loses its foundation. The Eastern Han Restoration, therefore, was not merely a political sequel, it was a corrective course in statecraft. By reducing the power of the central government, relocating the capital, and focusing on moderate recovery, Liu Xiu sought to avoid the aggressive mistakes of Emperor Wu and the catastrophic idealism of Wang Mang. But this moderation came at the cost of accepting the gentry's entrenched economic power, ensuring that the same structural tensions would plague the empire until its final fragmentation into the 3 kingdoms. The cultural impact of this era is perhaps its most profound legacy. The Western Han provided the historical and literary framework for the entire world's view of China. The meticulous records of Sima ensured that the history was preserved, analyzed, and synthesized, becoming the primary lens through which Chinese scholars viewed their own past, a cyclical narrative of rise, decline, and moral justification. The Han Dynasty, in its tragic failure and enduring legacy, taught the world that the art of empire lies not in conquest, but in the sustainable, equitable management of its internal divisions. The greatest dynasty in the ancient world was defined by its fall, proving that even a powerful, unified civilization is perpetually vulnerable to the quiet erosion of institutional virtue.